Hello, and thank you for tuning into this week's episode of Bite-Sized Cybercrime, the podcast where we discuss cybercrimes and cybersecurity news. This week we'll be talking about an old, abandoned, legitimate Microsoft Outlook plugin that was hijacked and used to steal around 4,000 credentials before being noticed. This is the first time that a malicious Microsoft Outlook plugin was able to do something like this. The Agree-To add-in for Microsoft was a legitimate one used for scheduling meetings by consolidating calendar information, and it's been in the Microsoft Store as an add-in since 2022, so not even that long ago. The add-in wasn't super popular because Microsoft kind of already has a built-in feature for this called Scheduling Assistant, which I use all the time. However, some people enjoyed Agree-To, as you could also consider your own personal calendars and not just your work ones. I still think it's rather niche and mostly covered by existing Outlook features. However, it did grow a small user base. But eventually, the developer, for whatever reason, just abandoned the project, leaving the associated domain up for grabs, even though the add-in was still available and completely functional. It was in some weird state of limbo where it works, but is no longer officially supported. It was never taken down, just left there. This allowed an attacker to step in and claim the domain that Agree-To used. Outlook add-ins are really just URLs that load special content into Outlook from the developer's server. Now, an attacker has the server, and they can load whatever content they want right into Outlook. The attacker used this opportunity to load a fake Microsoft sign-in window to collect passwords, exfiltrate them, and then will simply redirect back to the normal add-in. It's worth noting that there are indeed verification checks for having your plugins added to the Microsoft Store, but this is only for the initial upload. Once it exists in there, you don't need to go through any further verification. Microsoft implicitly trusts you. That is what makes abandoned projects like Agree-To rather dangerous. Attackers have a free way into a plugin that is publicly offered on Microsoft's store page. Users using Microsoft's store page think, well, this can't be malicious because Microsoft offers it in their official store. And of course, you already have the existing attached user base as well, who are none the wiser that their project has even been abandoned at all. When researchers discovered the campaign, which they named Agree-To Steal, they were able to access the channel used to exfiltrate the password data, and they found that nearly 4,000 accounts had been stolen, along with credit card and banking security questions, likely disguised as being for billing or identity purposes. Interestingly, the plugin could modify and send emails, but the attacker didn't end up exploiting this at all. Not to critique a threat actor on how they should better be tricking people, but this would have been a really effective way to phish people, especially if you did a little research on who the users you were exfiltrating credentials from were. The emails you have access to are already legitimate users, many of them using it at their companies. If you get someone in the right department, you could hijack even more accounts or steal other kinds of data. Microsoft removed the add-in on February 11th, but not before those 4,000 users had their credentials stolen. This demonstrates a rather important but not very talked about part of security: abandoned software. Sometimes you won't even know the software you're using has been abandoned until it's too late. The updates stop coming, but do you ever really even notice this? Many times when old websites are not renewed by the people who abandoned them and the domains are up for grabs, they can be taken by threat actors who then use that legitimate website in the trust that that website has already built up as either a phishing campaign or some other kind of malicious campaign, because that domain doesn't have any kind of negative history associated with it. It's fresh, it's new, it was trusted. This case is just the first time we've seen something like this happen with a Microsoft add-in specifically. And honestly, given the flow it went through, it would be pretty hard to even notice that your credentials are being stolen right under your nose, because sometimes you do just need to authenticate with Microsoft to log into something. This probably would have gotten me, honestly. So, that being said, what can you do about something like this happening? Well, of course, you should try your best to only use software that hasn't been abandoned and receives regular updates. It can be really difficult to notice when something is abandoned, which can be a problem, however. It may be a good idea to just check your apps and plugins every once in a while, especially your more obscure ones, and see if they've received any kind of update recently. And another thing that's important is if you notice something has changed with the flow of the plugin. I suspect that Microsoft add-in page, where you have to sign in, wasn't really there before. Or it may have been there before, but you would have to authenticate twice. Once to send it to the actual hackers, another time to send it to Microsoft. If this is different from how these apps usually work, that could be a sign that something very suspicious is going on, and I would at least look into it a little further. Of course, it's hard to know if something like this is happening, especially when it's in the moment, and maybe the news media hasn't caught up to this yet, but especially if you don't recall there being an update and something about the flow has changed, that might be a sign that you need to change your password. I'd also like to point out that two-factor authentication would prevent a lot of these credentials from being used. A hacker may be able to capture a singular one-time code, but that one-time code, once it expires in like 15 seconds, isn't going to be good for anything else. So, enabling multi-factor authentication on the email accounts you especially really care about is a good way to stop those accounts from being broken into or further exploited by attackers. Thank you to Bleeping Computer, The Hacker News, Malwarebytes, and TechRadar for reporting on this incident. I found it really interesting and kind of scary that things like plugins can just be taken over by malicious actors when they're abandoned. And of course, thank you for tuning into this week's episode of Bite-Sized Cybercrime. My name is Chloe Tonis, and until next time, stay secure.